June 10th, 1944. 4 days after the initial D-Day landings, a hedgerow near St-Lo, Normandy. Unteroffizier Klaus Richter pressed himself against the cold earth, his hands gripping the stock of his MG-34 machine gun with practiced familiarity. Behind the thick Norman hedge, his 3-man gun team waited in the firing position they'd prepared just hours before. The assistant gunner, Schütze Werner Hoffmann, crouched beside him with 2 ammunition belts ready, 250 rounds each. Their loader, young Heinrich, barely 18, huddled nearby with spare barrels wrapped in cloth to prevent noise. They could hear the Americans somewhere beyond the adjacent hedgerow, the distinctive rumble of Sherman tanks mixing with shouted orders in English. Richter had been fighting since Poland in 1939. He'd seen the MG-34 dominate battlefields from France to Russia, its distinctive 900 rounds per minute rate of fire, cutting down advancing soldiers with mechanical precision. The weapon in his hands was, without question, the most advanced machine gun in the world. But on this June morning in Normandy, everything Richter thought he knew about machine gun warfare was about to change. Within the next 30 minutes his position would cease to exist, not because of infantry assault, not because of tank breakthrough, but because of something the Germans had never faced in such overwhelming concentration: coordinated Allied firepower. The story of the MG-34 begins not in wartime but in the shadow of defeat. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles had restricted Germany to a maximum of 792 heavy machine guns and 1,134 light machine guns. Actual production and development of sustained fire weapons were prohibited, but Nazi Germany was committed to repudiating these restrictions. In 1932, the Reichswehrministerium ordered several companies, including Rheinmetall, to develop a new Einheitsmaschinengewehr, a universal machine gun, to replace several role-specific weapons then in German use. The specifications were ambitious. They wanted a weapon that could serve as a light machine gun with a bipod for offensive infantry operations, a medium machine gun on a tripod for sustained defensive fire, and even an anti-aircraft weapon. It needed to be air-cooled to avoid the weight and complexity of water-cooled systems. It had to be portable enough for one man to carry. And it needed to deliver firepower that could dominate the modern battlefield. The result was the MG-34, designed primarily by Heinrich Vollmer at Mauserwerke, based on the Rheinmetall Solothurn MG-30. What emerged in 1934 was a technological marvel, chambered for the powerful 7.92 by 57mm Mauser rifle cartridge. The MG-34 weighed just 26.5 pounds with its bipod attached. This was only marginally heavier than dedicated light machine guns like the British Bren at 22 pounds or the American Bar at 20 pounds, yet the MG-34 could do what those weapons could not. With a simple barrel change and mounting on the Lafette 34 tripod, which weighed an additional 52 pounds, it transformed into a sustained fire weapon, effective out to 3,500 meters. The MG-34 fires from an open bolt, a system that allows air to flow through the barrel between shots, cooling it naturally. When the trigger is pulled, the bolt moves forward, strips around from the belt, chambers it, and fires in one smooth motion. The recoil operation uses the force of firing to cycle the action, aided by a cone-shaped muzzle booster that redirects propellant gases to give additional momentum to the recoiling barrel. The engineering was exquisite. Every component was precisely machined from high-quality steel alloys. The feed mechanism could handle both 50-round drum magazines and non-disintegrating metal link belts of 250 rounds. The double crescent trigger provided instant fire selection. Pulling the top portion fired single shots. Pulling the lower portion unleashed full automatic fire at up to 900 rounds per minute. But the MG-34's technical brilliance was matched by a revolutionary tactical concept. Unlike Allied forces, which organised their infantry squads around the rifleman, German doctrine made the machine gun the centrepiece of infantry operations. A German Gruppe, or squad, at the start of the war consisted of 10 men. The non-commissioned officer squad leader, a deputy squad leader, a 3-man machine gun team including the gunner, assistant gunner, an ammunition carrier, and 5 riflemen. Those riflemen weren't the main combat power. Their primary job was to carry additional ammunition for the machine gun, provide security, and suppress enemy positions to allow the gun team to maneuver. A full squad carried 1/800 rounds of machine gun ammunition, distributed among its members. This was warfare built around sustained automatic fire. The riflemen, mostly armed with bolt-action carabiner 98K rifles, were support weapons for the machine gun, not the other way around. When a German squad attacked, the MG-34 provided the overwhelming majority of offensive firepower. When defending, it created killing zones that could pin down forces many times larger. In early campaigns, this system proved devastatingly effective. During the invasion of Poland in September 1939, German infantry using MG-34s in coordinated machine gun platoons overwhelmed Polish defenders. In France in 1940, the combination of rapid mechanized movement and concentrated machine gun firepower shattered Allied defensive positions. Even on the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces fielded their own capable machine guns like the DP-27, the MG-34's rate of fire and versatility gave German infantry squads an edge in firefights. Oberleutnant Friedrich Sander, who commanded an infantry company during the invasion of France, later described the weapon's impact. The MG-34 was the soul of the infantry. Everything else, the riflemen, the mortars, even the artillery support, existed to enable the machine guns to do their work. When our gunners opened fire, enemy formations would go to ground immediately. The sound alone, that distinctive ripping noise at 900 rounds per minute, had a psychological effect. Allied soldiers learned to fear it. One properly positioned MG-34 could hold an entire company at bay. I saw it happen multiple times. The British or French would advance, our gun would open up, and suddenly there would be dozens of men lying flat, unable to move forward or back. Then our riflemen would maneuver to flank positions while the gun kept them pinned. It was textbook. It worked every time. The MG-34's dominance stemmed from several technical advantages over Allied weapons. The American Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, fired the powerful .30-06 cartridge and was reliable, but it was fed from a 20-round box magazine and weighed 20 pounds loaded. A BAR gunner had to reload frequently, and the weapon was designed more for rapid single shots than sustained automatic fire. Its cyclic rate was only 550 rounds per minute. The British Bren gun was more comparable. Gas-operated and magazine-fed with 30-round box magazines, it fired the .33 British cartridge at about 500 rounds per minute. The Bren was accurate and reliable, beloved by British troops. But magazine feeding meant pauses for reloading. A Bren gunner might get off 100 rounds in a firefight before needing to change magazines 3 or 4 times, with several seconds of vulnerability during each change. The Soviet DP-27 was similar. Fed from a 47-round Pan magazine sitting on top of the action, it was rugged and reliable. Soviet infantry tactics called for multiple DP-27s in each platoon providing overlapping fire. But again, magazine feeding limited sustained fire capacity. The MG-34, by contrast, could fire continuously for as long as ammunition belts were fed into it. Standard practice was to link multiple 50-round belts together. In defensive positions, 250-round belts were common. The 3-man gun team worked in practice coordination. The gunner fired. The assistant fed belts and watched for targets. The ammunition carrier brought forward more belts and spare barrels. During sustained fire, the barrel would heat rapidly. German manuals specified that after 250 rounds the barrel should be changed. In combat, experienced crews pushed this to 400 rounds in emergencies. The barrel change procedure on the MG-34 was ingenious. The receiver was hinged to the barrel shroud. Releasing a latch on the left side of the receiver allowed the entire receiver assembly to pivot to the right. The gunner could then pull the hot barrel straight back out of the shroud. A new barrel slid into place from the rear. The receiver pivoted back into position and latched. A well-trained crew could complete the process in 10 to 15 seconds. The gunner wore asbestos mitts to handle the hot barrel. Done right, the pause in fire was barely noticeable. This ability to maintain sustained fire created tactical situations. No Allied squad-level weapon could match. A single MG-34 position could dominate an entire sector of battlefield. The effective range with a bipod was 800 to 1,000 meters for area targets. On the Lafette tripod with optical sights, skilled crews could engage targets out to 3,500 meters. The Germans even used indirect fire techniques developed in World War I, where machine gun crews would set up firing tables and lob bullets over terrain features onto pre-registered target areas. But the MG-34's greatest strength was also becoming its greatest vulnerability, though German commanders didn't realize it yet. The entire German infantry squad structure depended on the machine gun. If something happened to the gun or its crew, the squad lost most of its combat power. And in June 1944, the Allies had figured out exactly how to make that happen. Unteroffizier Klaus Richter had experienced Allied firepower before. In Russia, he'd endured Soviet artillery barrages that seemed to shake the earth itself. On the retreat from Kiev, Katyusha rockets had bracketed his position, the screaming salvos obliterating entire company areas. But Normandy was different. The sheer quantity and precision of Allied fire support exceeded anything the Eastern Front had prepared him for. The Americans called it combined arms warfare. The British called it fire planning. The soldiers on the ground just called it hell. Every Allied attack in Normandy followed a similar pattern. First came artillery, not random shelling, but carefully coordinated time-on-target shoots where multiple batteries fired at different times so their shells arrived simultaneously. The first indication would be a sound like ripping canvas in the sky. Then the world exploded. High explosive rounds would airburst above German positions, sending shrapnel slicing through anyone caught in the open. Armour-piercing rounds would penetrate bunkers and fortifications. White phosphorus would blanket areas in burning chemical clouds that adhered to skin and couldn't be extinguished. American artillery was particularly effective because of their fire control system. Forward observers, often in direct contact with infantry platoon leaders, could call for fire and have shells impacting within minutes. The Americans had developed a system called the Fire Direction Center, where coordinates were rapidly calculated and transmitted to gun batteries. Multiple artillery battalions could mass their fire on a single target, creating overwhelming destruction. In one documented instance during the Normandy campaign, 3 full-strength panzer divisions attempted to assemble near Caen for a counterattack. American and British artillery had their assembly areas so precisely mapped that the divisions came under immediate concentrated fire. The attack was called off before it even began, less than 24 hours after the barrage started. German artillery, by contrast, was hampered by ammunition shortages and lack of mobility. The Luftwaffe had been driven from the skies, meaning German artillery observers had no aerial reconnaissance. American fighter bombers targeted German supply columns, making it nearly impossible to stockpile ammunition near the front lines. By mid-June 1944, the German 5th Panzer Army in Normandy could fire only about 10% of what the British artillery opposite them fired. After the artillery came the tanks. The Allies had learned to integrate armour directly with infantry attacks. American doctrine in Normandy called for infantry tank teams where companies of infantry would be matched with platoons of Sherman tanks. The Shermans weren't leading the attacks, as early doctrine suggested. Instead, they advanced alongside infantry, providing mobile fire support. A Sherman's 75mm gun could demolish fortified positions, blast through hedgerows, and suppress German machine gun nests. The tank's .30 caliber machine guns, both bow and coaxial, added additional firepower. Most importantly, the tanks drew fire. German anti-tank weapons, including the feared Panzerfaust handheld rocket launchers, would engage the Shermans. This often revealed German positions which the tanks could then target directly. The infantry used the tanks as mobile cover, advancing in their lee, using the armour to protect them from machine gun fire. British tactics were similar. Their infantry training manuals from 1944 emphasised using ground for concealment and maximising covering fire. But they'd added a crucial element. Infantry would actually ride on the backs of tanks into the assault area. Once within range of enemy positions, the infantry would dismount, deploy and attack while the tanks provided direct fire support. Then came the air support. The Allies had achieved complete air superiority over Normandy. German Luftwaffe fighters rarely appeared. Allied fighter bombers, particularly American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons, prowled constantly. Infantry units could call in airstrikes through air support parties attached to division headquarters. The fighter bombers carried bombs, rockets and machine guns. A single pass by a flight of Typhoons armed with rockets could obliterate German positions that infantry might have taken hours to reduce. The psychological effect was immense. German soldiers learned to dig deeper, to camouflage better, to move only at night. But even that wasn't always enough. Klaus Richter's position near St-Lô was typical of German defensive tactics in the bocage. The hedgerows of Normandy, those ancient earthen walls topped with thick vegetation that divided the fields into small compartments, were natural fortifications. German infantry had turned them into killing grounds. An MG-34 positioned behind a hedgerow with interlocking fields of fire to adjacent positions could stop Allied advances cold. Standard procedure was to position the gun to cover approaches, with the barrel just barely protruding through the hedge. The gun team would dig in, creating a fighting position with overhead cover if time permitted. Ammunition would be stacked within easy reach. Spare barrels would be laid out. Pre-registered firing points would be established, distances measured and memorized. When Allied forces appeared in the next field, the MG-34 would open fire. At 800 metres, the 7.92mm rounds would still hit with lethal force. The Americans or British would go to ground, seeking what cover they could. Then German mortars would begin bracketing them. If the Allies tried to flank, other MG-34 positions covering adjacent approaches would engage. It had worked against the Poles. It had worked against the French. It had even worked against the Soviets in many engagements. But on this morning, June 10, 1944, it didn't work. The Americans Richter faced weren't using the tactics of 1940 or even 1941. These were soldiers who'd trained specifically for hedgerow fighting, equipped with resources the Polish or French armies of 1940 could never have imagined. The attack began with smoke. Richter saw white clouds blossom in the field beyond his position, wind-deployed smoke grenades creating an instant screen. Then came artillery. Not a rolling barrage advancing across the field, but precise targeting. Richter's position, and the 3 other MG-34 positions covering this sector, had been spotted by American reconnaissance the day before. An American forward observer, Captain James Mitchell of the 29th Infantry Division's Artillery Liaison Team, had called in the coordinates. 3 battalions of 105mm howitzers, 36 guns total, fired a time-on-target shoot. The shells arrived within a span of 5 seconds. The hedgerow position to Richter's left simply vanished. One moment there was an emplacement with 4 German soldiers. The next there was torn earth, smoke, and silence. The position to his right took a direct hit. Richter saw debris flying, heard screaming that cut off abruptly. His own position was bracketed. Shells impacted 20 metres in front, 30 metres behind. Shrapnel whistled overhead. The concussion was so intense it felt like being punched repeatedly in the chest. Heinrich, the young ammunition carrier, was struck by shell fragments. He collapsed without a sound, blood spreading across his field tunic. Through the smoke and dust, shapes appeared. Sherman tanks, 3 of them, grinding through the hedgerow at a point the Germans hadn't heavily mined. The Shermans had been fitted with jury-rigged steel teeth on their fronts, welded-on plough blades that Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry had invented just weeks earlier. These Rhino tanks could punch through the hedgerows that had stopped earlier advances. Behind the Shermans came infantry, at least 2 full platoons, maybe 60 or 70 men. They weren't advancing in lines. They were moving in small groups, using the terrain, using smoke, leapfrogging forward as some groups laid down covering fire and others advanced. Richter opened fire. The MG-34's distinctive sound, that high-pitched ripping noise, cut through the chaos. He walked his fire across the field, saw soldiers drop, saw others go flat. But the return fire was overwhelming. The Sherman's bow machine gun opened up, then its coaxial. The 75mm gun fired high-explosive round impacting the hedgerow 10 metres to Richter's right. Earth and vegetation rained down. More artillery came in, this time American mortar fire. 81mm mortars from the battalion mortar platoon were dropping rounds in a precise pattern, each one adjusted by observers who were walking the fire onto known German positions. Hoffmann, the assistant gunner, fed another belt into the MG-34. Richter fired in short bursts, 5 to 7 rounds, pausing to aim, firing again. The barrel was getting hot. They'd already fired nearly 400 rounds. He needed to change barrels soon, but there was no time. The Americans kept coming. Now small arms fire was impacting all around the position. M1 Garand rifles, firing their distinctive 8-round clips, crack, crack, crack in rapid succession. Browning automatic rifles opening up with 20-round bursts, Thompson submachine guns at closer range, and something else, something heavier. American 30 caliber machine guns, probably M19 or 19A4s on tripods, were engaging from positions the infantry had set up. The Americans had their own machine guns, and they were using them to suppress Richter's position while other elements manoeuvred. This was the key that German intelligence analysts had missed in their assessment of Allied tactics. The Americans didn't build their squad around one machine gun. They had multiple automatic weapons at every level. At squad level, the Browning automatic rifle. At platoon level, a light machine gun section. At company level, a weapons platoon with multiple M19 machine guns and 60mm mortars. And beyond that, artillery that could be called in within minutes, tanks that would advance with the infantry, fighter bombers on station overhead ready to strike. The Germans built their tactics around the MG-34's superiority in sustained fire. But the Allies had responded by creating a system where no single weapon needed to be superior. They achieved superiority through coordination, through layered supporting fires, through the integration of all combat arms. Richter tried to traverse his fire toward the advancing infantry. A Sherman 75mm gun fired again. This time the round hit the hedgerow directly in front of his position. The explosion was cataclysmic. The blast wave picked Richter up and threw him backward. His vision went white, then black, then cleared slowly. His ears were ringing so loudly he couldn't hear anything else. Hoffman was down, not moving. The MG-34 was on its side, half buried in dirt. Richter tried to stand, couldn't. His left leg wouldn't support weight. Through clearing vision, he saw American soldiers coming through. The gap in the hedgerow, weapons ready, moving tactically. The engagement had lasted maybe 8 minutes. His position was destroyed. 2 of his 3-man gun crew were casualties. The weapon that was supposed to dominate the battlefield had been systematically neutralized by coordinated Allied firepower. This scene played out thousands of times across Normandy in June and July 1944. The MG-34 and its later brother, the MG-42, hadn't become ineffective weapons. They were still technically superior to most Allied squad weapons in rate of fire and sustained fire capability. But their tactical effectiveness had been gutted by Allied combined arms doctrine. The Americans had studied German tactics intensively. After early setbacks in North Africa, particularly at Kasserine Pass, where German combined arms operations had badly mauled American units, the US Army had conducted extensive analysis. Training centers in the United States ran exercises specifically designed to teach infantry how to deal with German machine gun tactics. The key lesson was simple. Don't try to outshoot the MG-34 with your own squad weapons. Instead, use artillery to suppress it, use tanks to destroy its position, use maneuver to bypass it, and use overwhelming firepower from multiple sources to ensure that even if the gun itself survived, its crew couldn't effectively operate it. British tactics evolved similarly. Montgomery's 8th Army had fought the Germans in North Africa and Italy. They'd learned the hard way that frontal attacks against prepared positions dominated by machine guns resulted in unacceptable casualties. The British response was to emphasise methodical operations with massive artillery support. Before any significant attack, British artillery would conduct devastating preparation fires. This wasn't the World War I tactic of days-long barrages that destroyed surprise. Instead, it was concentrated fire immediately before attack, timed precisely to suppress German positions long enough for British infantry to close. The British also emphasised what they called fire and movement tactics, where one infantry subunit would provide covering fire while another manoeuvred. This required careful coordination, but it meant that German machine gunners were always under fire from some direction, making it difficult to engage targets effectively. British training manuals from 1944 specified that section commanders, roughly equivalent to American squad leaders, needed to direct covering fire and coordinate movement. The goal was to create situations where the German machine gun crew faced impossible choices. Fire at one advancing element and take fire from another. Try to engage multiple targets and reduce effectiveness against all of them. Retreat and give up the position. Soviet tactics on the Eastern Front had evolved even more dramatically. Early in the war, Soviet rifle divisions had attempted to overwhelm German positions through sheer mass, accepting horrific casualties. By 1943, Soviet doctrine emphasized artillery preparation on a scale the Western Allies never attempted. Before major operations, Soviet artillery would bombard German lines for hours or even days, using thousands of guns to systematically destroy defensive positions. Soviet infantry learned to assault immediately after the barrage lifted, while German defenders were still stunned and disorganized. They also made extensive use of combat engineers to clear mines and obstacles, and deployed flamethrowers and satchel charges to destroy fortifications. The Soviets accepted that German machine guns were superior weapons. so they created conditions where those weapons couldn't be effectively employed. But it was in Normandy where all these lessons came together most effectively. The bocage country with its hedgerows was ideal defensive terrain for the Germans. Every field was a natural compartment. Every hedgerow was a potential defensive position. The Americans initially struggled with these conditions. In the first weeks after D-Day, American units took heavy casualties attacking through the hedgerows. German machine guns would wait until American infantry was exposed in open fields, then open fire from concealed positions. The Americans would go to ground, call for support, and then spend hours reducing single positions. Progress was measured in fields per day. But the American response showed the flexibility that would ultimately win the campaign. At every level, from squad leaders to division commanders, American forces identified problems and developed solutions. Sergeant Curtis Cullen invented the Rhino tank modification that allowed Shermans to burst through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. This eliminated the vulnerable moment when a tank would be exposed on top of a hedgerow silhouetted against the sky. Engineers developed techniques for using explosives to blast gaps in hedgerows, creating entry points for assaults. Infantry squads refined their tactics, using scouts to identify German positions, then calling in precise artillery fire before advancing. The artillery itself became more responsive. Forward observers pushed farther forward, sometimes accompanying assault platoons directly. Radio procedures were streamlined. The time between calling for fire and rounds impacting dropped from 15 or 20 minutes early in the campaign to as little as 3 to 5 minutes by late June. American artillery also developed the technique of massing fires from multiple battalions on single targets. A typical time-on-target shoot might involve 3 or 4 battalions, 36 to 48 guns, all firing at different times, so their shells arrived simultaneously. The German defenders would have no warning, just sudden, devastating impact. This made German positions, no matter how well prepared, vulnerable to sudden obliteration. Tank infantry coordination improved dramatically. Initially, many American tank units had advanced independently, which exposed them to German anti-tank weapons and left infantry without fire support. By late June, standard procedure was for tanks to be attached directly to infantry companies. Tank platoon leaders and infantry company commanders would coordinate their attacks, with tanks providing direct fire support while infantry protected tanks from German infantry with their Panzerfaust weapons. This integration meant that German machine gun positions were almost always under fire from multiple weapon systems. The psychological effect on German defenders was profound. Lieutenant Heinrich Braun, who commanded an infantry platoon in the 352nd Infantry Division near St. Lo, later described the experience. "We knew the Americans had more artillery than us. We knew they had air superiority. But the reality of it, day after day, was crushing. Every time we set up a position, every time we placed our machine guns to cover an approach, we knew that within hours or at most a day, American observers would spot us. Then would come artillery, not random shelling. Precise, concentrated fire that would obliterate our positions. Our MG-34s were magnificent weapons. But what good is a magnificent weapon when the crew is dead from artillery fire before the infantry even attacks? We learned to dig deeper, to camouflage better, to keep moving our positions every night. But it was never enough. The Americans had so many resources, so much ammunition, that they could afford to shell every suspected position. We would hear them sometimes, American forward observers calling in grid coordinates by radio. They were so casual about it, requesting fire missions like someone ordering supplies, and minutes later shells would arrive. Our commanders told us to hold every position, to make the Americans pay for every meter. But how do you hold a position that's under constant artillery fire? How do you operate a machine gun effectively when every time you fire you know that counter-battery fire will arrive within minutes? The Americans didn't defeat our weapons. They defeated our ability to use those weapons effectively. This was the reality that German propaganda never acknowledged. In newsreels and military publications, the German military continued to emphasize the superiority of German small arms, the effectiveness of German infantry tactics, the fighting spirit of German soldiers. But at the tactical level, German infantry in Normandy were being systematically destroyed by an enemy who'd learned to neutralize their key advantages through combined arms integration. The MG-34 remained technically superior to most Allied squad weapons, but technical superiority meant nothing when the weapon system existed within a tactical environment, specifically designed to negate it. One of the clearest examples of this came during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Normandy beachhead in late July 1944. The operation began with a massive aerial bombardment by American heavy bombers, followed by artillery preparation, then armoured thrusts supported by infantry. German defensive positions, many centred on machine gun strongpoints, were simply obliterated by the weight of explosives dropped on them. Those positions that survived the bombardment found themselves bypassed by fast-moving American armour, cut off and forced to surrender or face destruction. Oberst Hans von Luck, who commanded the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, wrote in his post-war memoir about the hopelessness of the situation. Our men fought with courage and skill. Our weapons, including our machine guns, were as effective as they had ever been. But we were fighting an enemy who had learned from their mistakes, who had resources we couldn't match, and who had developed a system of warfare that made our defensive tactics obsolete. I watched entire companies destroyed by artillery fire that was called in with such precision and arrived so quickly that there was no time to take cover. I saw positions held by skilled machine gunners wiped out by single tank rounds fired from 800 metres away. The Americans and British had learned a fundamental lesson. If they couldn't match our weapons 1 for 1, they would bring 5 to 1 superiority, or 10 to 1, or whatever it took, and they had the industrial capacity to do exactly that. The production statistics support his assessment. Germany produced approximately 350,000 MG Th-34s during the war. This sounds impressive until compared to Allied production. The United States alone produced over 2 million M1 Garand rifles, 350,000 Browning automatic rifles, and 500,000 M1919 series machine guns. When you added British, Soviet, and other Allied production, the disparity was overwhelming. But more than just numbers, it was the integration of those weapons into effective tactical systems that mattered. An American infantry regiment in Normandy had organic artillery support from its own cannon company, access to attached artillery battalions from division, support from tank destroyer battalions, liaison with Army Air Force fighter bomber groups, and engineer support for obstacle clearance and demolition. A German infantry regiment had its machine gun companies, some attached mortar units, and whatever artillery support could be spared, which by June 1944 was minimal due to ammunition shortages. The Germans still had tactical skill, fighting spirit and weapons that were often superior in technical specifications, but they were operating within a system that couldn't provide the support needed to employ those weapons effectively. Richter survived his wounds. The American medics treated him along with their own casualties, a courtesy that surprised him. During his interrogation at a prisoner collection point, an American intelligence officer asked him about German tactics and weapons. Richter, still dazed from his injuries, spoke honestly. Your weapons aren't better than ours. Your soldiers aren't. Better trained than ours. But your system, the way you bring everything together, artillery and tanks and aircraft, all coordinated, all hitting us at once. We have nothing to match that. Our machine guns are excellent, but they can't fire when they're buried under rubble from your artillery. Our infantry is skilled. But they can't fight when they're being strafed by your aircraft. You don't win through superiority of individual weapons. You win through superiority of systems. The American officer noted this down. It confirmed what American military analysts had concluded through months of careful study. German tactical proficiency at the small unit level was high. German weapons were often superior in specifications, but the German military had failed to develop the logistical and doctrinal systems needed to integrate all combat arms effectively under the conditions of mid-war combat. The MG-34's fate in Normandy was mirrored across all theatres by late 1944. On the Eastern Front, Soviet artillery and breakthrough tactics systematically destroyed German defensive positions. In Italy, Allied forces developed specialised tactics for mountain warfare that emphasised small unit infiltration and precision artillery fire to neutralise German strongpoints. Even the Germans' own assessment recognised the changing tactical environment. Reports from frontline units in late 1944 consistently noted that German infantry's defensive effectiveness was being degraded not by frontal assault but by preparatory fires. Artillery, tank fire and airstrikes were killing or pinning German infantry before Allied ground forces ever closed to small arms range. Machine guns couldn't defend positions that were being destroyed by high explosive rounds from kilometers away. The MG42, introduced in 1942 to replace the MG34, offered some improvements. It was cheaper and faster to produce, with more stamped parts and looser tolerances that made it more reliable in adverse conditions. Its rate of fire was even higher, around 200 rounds per minute compared to the MG34's 900. But tactically it faced the same problems. A weapon system, no matter how advanced, only matters if it can be effectively employed in combat. And by 1944, Allied forces had created tactical environments where German machine guns couldn't be effectively employed. The numbers tell the story. In the Normandy campaign from June 6 to August 25, 1944, German forces in the West lost approximately 240,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. They lost virtually all their heavy equipment, including most of their artillery and many of their machine guns. Allied casualties were also heavy, around 209,000 American, British, Canadian, and other Allied troops, but the Allies could replace their losses. Fresh divisions arrived from Britain. New equipment came across the beaches or through the artificial Mulberry harbours. German replacements trickled in slowly, were often poorly trained, and arrived with inadequate equipment. By September 1944, as Allied forces advanced across France toward Germany, the tactical situation had completely shifted. German units were fighting defensive actions, trying to slow Allied advances rather than hold positions. Mobile warfare meant that prepared defensive positions with carefully sighted machine guns were less relevant. German infantry were constantly retreating, unable to properly employ their weapons. The MG34 and MG42 continued to be effective when German units could establish temporary defensive positions. But the systematic Allied approach, artillery preparation, tank infantry coordination, air support, and combined arms integration meant that even these positions could be reduced relatively quickly. The contrast with 1940 is stark. Then German combined arms tactics, with machine guns providing a base of fire while armour and infantry manoeuvred, had shattered Allied armies. German tactical proficiency, supported by superior operational planning and better integration of combat arms, had won stunning victories. By 1944, the Allies had learned those lessons. They developed their own combined arms doctrine, supported by industrial production that Germany couldn't match. The MG34, which had once been the symbol of German tactical superiority, became a symbol of how technical excellence alone couldn't guarantee victory. Post-war analysis by military historians has consistently identified the Normandy campaign as a turning point in infantry tactics. The German emphasis on squad-level firepower through machine guns was recognised as innovative and effective, but it required a tactical environment where the machine gun could be employed effectively. The Allies created an environment where it couldn't, using overwhelming artillery, integrated armour support, and air superiority to systematically destroy German defensive positions. The lesson learned by Western militaries in the post-war era was clear. Combined arms integration at all levels, from squad to army, was essential. No single weapon system, no matter how advanced, could be decisive on its own. Success came from integrating multiple weapon systems, multiple supporting arms, and developing tactics that maximized friendly strengths while exploiting enemy weaknesses. The modern concept of combined arms warfare, which remains central to Western military doctrine, traces directly to the lessons learned in Normandy. The MG34 didn't fail because it was a bad weapon. It failed because the system it operated within couldn't match Allied combined arms integration. Klaus Richter spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp in England, then briefly in the United States. After the war, he returned to Germany, became a schoolteacher, and rarely spoke about his combat experiences. In a 1978 interview for a local history project, the interviewer asked him about the MG34 and whether it was as effective as German propaganda had claimed. His response was thoughtful. The MG34 was an excellent weapon. Technically, it may have been the best machine gun of the war, but by 1944, especially in Normandy, technical excellence didn't matter. The Americans buried us in explosives, artillery, bombs, tank fire, everything at once. My machine gun couldn't fire back at artillery batteries 5 kilometers away. It couldn't shoot down aircraft. It couldn't destroy tanks at long range. When I finally did get to use it against infantry, The return fire was so heavy from so many sources that we couldn't maintain effective fire. We learned a hard lesson. Modern war isn't won by individual weapons, no matter how good. It's won by systems, by logistics, by coordination. Germany developed an excellent weapon and built tactics around it. The Allies developed a system that made that weapon irrelevant. Looking back, the outcome was inevitable. We just didn't know it yet in 1943 and early 1944. We believed our weapons and our tactical skill would be enough. They weren't. The MG-34 remained in service with the German military through the end of the war and continued in use with various militaries for decades afterward. East German forces used them into the 1950s. Some surplus weapons were sold to other nations and saw service in conflicts through the 1960s and beyond. As a weapon design, it influenced post-war machine gun development worldwide. But its historical significance lies not in its technical specifications, impressive as they were, but in what its tactical employment revealed about the nature of modern warfare. When the MG-34 met coordinated Allied firepower in Normandy in June 1944, the encounter demonstrated a fundamental truth that would shape military doctrine for the remainder of the 20th century. No weapon, no matter how advanced, could be decisive in isolation. Victory came through integration, through systems, through the ability to mass fires from multiple sources in coordinated fashion. The Germans had built their infantry tactics around the machine gun's dominance. The Allies responded by building systems that made that dominance impossible to achieve. The ripping sound of the MG-34's high rate of fire, which had terrorized Allied soldiers in 1940 and 1941, became just one more noise in the overwhelming symphony of destruction that Allied combined arms warfare could bring to bear. In the hedgerows of Normandy, among countless similar engagements across thousands of fields, the MG-34 lost its edge. Not because it became a worse weapon, but because the enemy learned how to fight in ways that made its strengths irrelevant. The lesson has echoed through military history ever since. Technical superiority is temporary, tactical adaptability is eternal, and in modern warfare, systems matter more than individual components. The day the MG-34 met coordinated Allied fire in Normandy wasn't just about one weapon or one battle. It was about the evolution of warfare itself, from reliance on superior weapons to mastery of integrated systems. The Germans brought the best machine gun of the war to Normandy. The Allies brought a system the Germans couldn't match. That made all the difference. The evolution of Allied fire coordination didn't happen overnight. It was built through painful lessons, starting in North Africa where American forces first encountered German defensive tactics built around machine gun strongpoints. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces under Erwin Rommel had demonstrated exactly how devastating properly employed MG-34s could be when integrated with armour and artillery. American infantry, advancing in relatively open formations, were cut down by interlocking machine gun fire. When they sought cover, German mortars bracketed them. When they tried to manoeuvre, German tanks appeared to exploit gaps. The American II Corps suffered over 6,000 casualties in less than a week. The Germans lost fewer than 1,000 men. It was a humiliating defeat that forced American commanders to completely rethink their tactical approach. Major General Omar Bradley, who took command of Dru's Corps after Kasserine, ordered extensive after-action analysis. American intelligence officers interviewed survivors, studied German tactics, and began developing countermeasures. What emerged was a recognition that the German squad structure, with its machine gun centerpiece, created both strengths and critical vulnerabilities. If the machine gun could be suppressed or destroyed, the entire squad lost most of its combat power. The Germans typically had only one MG-34 per squad. Kill or suppress that gun, and the remaining riflemen with their bolt-action Kar-98Ks couldn't generate enough firepower to stop a determined assault. The question was how to suppress or destroy the gun before it could inflict unacceptable casualties. The answer lay in coordination. American doctrine began emphasizing the integration of all available fire support. Infantry couldn't defeat German machine guns with small arms alone, but infantry supported by artillery, with tank support, with air cover, could create conditions where German machine guns couldn't operate effectively. The key was timing and communication. Forward observer training was revolutionized. Before North Africa, artillery forward observers were often specialists who operated somewhat independently of infantry units. After Kasserine, forward observers were integrated directly into infantry companies and even platoons. They trained with the infantry, learned to think like infantry commanders, and developed the ability to rapidly call for fire on targets of opportunity. The fire direction center system was refined. Before the war, artillery fire missions could take 30 minutes or more to process, by which time the tactical situation had often changed completely. The new system used pre-calculated firing data for grid squares across the entire operational area. When a forward observer called for fire, the fire direction center could immediately reference the pre-calculated data, make minor adjustments for current wind and weather conditions, and have rounds in the air within minutes. Time on target shoots, where multiple batteries fired at staggered times so all rounds arrived simultaneously, became standard procedure for attacking prepared positions. This eliminated warning and gave defenders no time to take cover. The first indication of incoming fire was the sound of shells arriving, followed immediately by devastating explosions. Radio communications improved dramatically. Early in the war, radio reliability was poor and communication security was a constant concern. By 1944, American infantry companies had multiple radios, including the SCR-300 backpack radio that allowed platoon leaders to communicate directly with company commanders and forward observers. This meant that a platoon pinned down by German machine gun fire could have artillery support within minutes, sometimes within seconds if the forward observer had pre-registered likely target areas. The British developed parallel systems. Their artillery, already highly professional and well-trained, became even more responsive. British doctrine emphasised defensive fire plans where likely German approach routes and assembly areas were pre-registered. When German forces appeared, British forward observers could simply call for fire by reference number, and shells would impact on coordinates that had been surveyed and calculated days or weeks earlier. British infantry training also emphasised fire and movement at the section level, which was their equivalent of an American squad. One fire team would engage German positions with rifle and Bren gunfire, while another team manoeuvred to a flanking position. This forced German machine gunners to choose between targets, degrading their effectiveness. The Bren gun, while magazine-fed and therefore limited to 30-round bursts, was accurate and reliable enough to suppress German positions during these manoeuvres. The integration of armour with infantry required careful doctrinal work. Early in the war, American armour doctrine had emphasised independent armoured operations, with tanks operating as exploitation forces rather than infantry support. This worked well in open terrain like North Africa once American forces learned proper tactics, but it was less effective in the close terrain of Italy and later Normandy. By 1944, American doctrine explicitly called for tank infantry teams. Tank platoons would be attached to infantry companies for extended periods, allowing the two arms to train together and develop mutual understanding. Tank platoon leaders and infantry company commanders would coordinate their attacks in detail. Infantry would advance with tanks, using the armour as mobile cover and suppressing German anti-tank teams. Tanks would engage German strongpoints with their main guns and machine guns, destroying positions that infantry alone couldn't reduce. The key innovation was combined planning. Before an attack, infantry and tank commanders would study the terrain together, identify likely German positions, determine routes of advance, and establish communication procedures. During the attack, infantry would mark targets for tanks using coloured smoke or tracer fire. Tanks would suppress those targets while infantry manoeuvred. If German anti-tank weapons engaged the tanks, infantry would identify and eliminate those positions. This level of integration required extensive training. In England, before D-Day, American and British units spent months practicing combined arms operations. Infantry companies would conduct repeated exercises with attached tank platoons, working out communication procedures, learning each other's capabilities and limitations. Tank crews learned to think like infantry, understanding that their role was to support the foot soldiers rather than charging ahead independently. Infantry learned to trust the tanks, to use them as mobile strongpoints, rather than fearing they would draw fire onto infantry positions. Artillery units practiced time-on-target shoots until they could consistently drop shells onto targets within seconds of each other. Forward observers practiced calling for fire until they could provide accurate coordinates under stress, in darkness, while under fire themselves. The training was repetitive, sometimes boring, but it built the muscle memory that would prove essential in combat. When American units landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, they brought with them a level of combined arms proficiency that German units couldn't match. Not because American soldiers were better individually, but because they'd been trained within a system that emphasized integration and coordination. The German military, by contrast, had become increasingly fragmented by 1944. The Luftwaffe controlled its own ground forces, including Fallschirmjäger paratrooper divisions and Luftwaffe field divisions. The Waffen-SS had its own divisions with separate chains of command. The Wehrmacht was split between forces on the Eastern Front and Western Front, with little coordination between the two. Even within individual armies, coordination between branches was often poor. Artillery units operated with limited ammunition due to supply shortages and had difficulty coordinating with infantry because of inadequate radio communications. German radio production had never matched Allied output, and by 1944, many German infantry companies lacked the radios needed for effective coordination. This meant that German infantry often fought in isolation, unable to call for fire support even when artillery was available. The rigid German command structure also worked against them. German doctrine emphasized following orders from higher headquarters rather than showing initiative at lower levels. While this worked well in the offensive operations of 1939 through 1941, when German forces had the initiative and could dictate the pace of battle, it was less effective in defensive operations where tactical situations changed rapidly. A German platoon leader pinned down by Allied fire couldn't simply call for artillery support. He had to report to his company commander, who reported to battalion, who coordinated with the artillery commander, who assigned the fire mission. By the time shells arrived, if they arrived at all, the tactical situation had often changed completely. The German emphasis on individual weapon quality over system integration was a legacy of their interwar development. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles had limited German forces to 100,000 men with restricted heavy weapons. The Reichswehr, the German military during the Weimar period, compensated by emphasizing quality over quantity. Each weapon had to be excellent because they had so few. Each soldier had to be highly trained because the army was so small. This created a culture that prized technical excellence and individual proficiency. When Hitler came to power and began rearming in defiance of Versailles, this culture persisted. German weapons development focused on creating the best possible individual weapons. The MG-34 wasn't just good, it was the best machine gun in the world by most technical measures. The Kar-98K rifle was accurate and reliable. German artillery pieces were well designed and effective, but less attention was paid to the systems that would integrate these weapons into coordinated operations. Radio production was inadequate. Forward observer training was limited. Artillery ammunition production never matched the rates needed for sustained operations. These systemic weaknesses didn't matter much in the early war when German forces had overwhelming advantages in training, doctrine, and operational planning. But by 1944, as Allied forces had closed the training and doctrinal gaps, the systemic weaknesses became critical. The Bocage fighting in Normandy revealed these weaknesses starkly. A typical German infantry company in June 1944 might have 9 MG-34s or MG-42s, 1 per squad in 3 platoons, plus additional machine guns in a weapons platoon. On paper, this was formidable firepower. In practice, these machine guns operated largely independently. Each squad leader positioned his gun based on his assessment of the terrain and likely Allied approaches. Coordination between squads was limited to whatever the company commander could arrange through runners, or the few available radios. When Allied forces attacked, each German machine gun position fought its own battle. The gun would engage Allied infantry until it was destroyed by artillery, knocked out by tank fire, or overrun by infantry who'd manoeuvred around it using smoke and suppressive fire. Once the gun was eliminated, the remaining German riflemen in that squad couldn't generate enough firepower to hold their position. They would retreat or be captured. The next squad, perhaps 100 or 200 meters away, might not even know their neighbouring position had fallen until Allied forces appeared in their flank. American and British infantry, by contrast, operated within a web of supporting fires. A typical American infantry company attack in Normandy would begin with the company commander conferring with his attached tank platoon leader and the artillery forward observer. They would identify the objective, study aerial photographs or maps, and determine likely German positions. The artillery forward observer would pre-register fires on those positions and on likely German fallback positions. The tank platoon leader would identify routes where tanks could support the infantry advance without becoming bogged down or exposed to German anti-tank fire. The company commander would brief his platoon leaders, assigning each a zone of advance and coordinating movement. When the attack began, artillery would fire a preparation barrage on known or suspected German positions. The timing would be precise. Rounds would impact for a planned duration, usually 2 to 5 minutes, then shift to German fallback positions. The infantry would begin their advance during the last minute of the preparation fire, timing their movement so they reached the German positions shortly after the artillery lifted. Tanks would advance with the infantry, usually slightly behind and to the flanks where they could observe and engage German positions without blocking the infantry's advance. If German machine guns opened fire, the immediate response was coordinated suppression. Infantry squad leaders would direct their Browning automatic rifle gunners to fire on the German position. Platoon leaders would bring up their light machine guns. The forward observer would call for artillery fire on the German position. Tank commanders would identify the position and engage it with their main guns or machine guns. This layered response meant that German machine gunners faced immediate, overwhelming fire from multiple sources at multiple ranges. The psychological effect was crushing. Lieutenant Otto Brenner, who commanded an infantry platoon in the 243rd Infantry Division near St. Lo, described the experience in a post-war interview. "We knew the Americans had more resources than us, but until you experienced it, you couldn't understand what it meant. One of my machine gun teams would open fire on advancing Americans. Within seconds, return fire would come from multiple directions. Rifles, machine guns, those Browning automatic rifles they used. Then mortar rounds would start landing, then tank fire, then artillery. It was overwhelming. My gunners couldn't maintain fire effectively. They would shoot a burst, then have to take cover as return fire impacted all around them. If they tried to continue firing, they would be killed. We learned to fire short bursts, then immediately move the gun to a different position. But even that often didn't work. The Americans seemed to have unlimited ammunition. They would just keep firing, keep shelling, until our position was destroyed or we retreated. I lost 3 machine gun teams in 1 week. Good men, well trained, with excellent weapons, but they couldn't fight effectively under those conditions. The weapon didn't fail them. The system they were operating within failed them." His testimony, corroborated by hundreds of similar accounts from German prisoners and post-war interviews, reveals the fundamental problem German infantry faced. They were tactically proficient, well armed at the squad level, and often fighting from good defensive positions. But they existed within a system that couldn't provide the support needed to effectively employ their weapons against an enemy who had learned to neutralize those weapons through systematic application of overwhelming firepower. The evolution of Allied air support added another dimension to German difficulties. In North Africa and Italy, air support for ground forces had been somewhat haphazard. Communication between ground units and aircraft was difficult. Identification of friendly forces was uncertain. Airstrikes were often called in hours or days in advance, targeting strategic objectives rather than providing tactical support. By Normandy, this had changed dramatically. The development of the air support party system meant that trained air liaison officers were attached to infantry divisions. These officers could communicate directly with fighter bomber squadrons on station overhead. When ground forces encountered German strongpoints, the air support party could vector aircraft onto the target within minutes. The fighter bombers, usually P-47 Thunderbolts or RAF Typhoons, would mark the target with coloured smoke, then make strafing or bombing runs. The effect on German morale was devastating. Obergefreiter Hans Möller, an MG-42 gunner in the 302nd Infantry Division, recalled, "The aircraft terrified us more than the artillery. You could hear artillery shells coming, at least sometimes. The aircraft appeared without warning. We would be in our position, perhaps firing at American infantry, and suddenly there would be a roar overhead and explosions all around us. The American Thunderbolts had 8 machine guns. When they strafed our positions, it sounded like the world was being torn apart, and they carried bombs and rockets too. I saw a Typhoon attack a machine gun position 50 meters from mine. The rockets hit like artillery shells. The position just vanished. The gun, the crew, everything was gone. After that, whenever we heard aircraft engines, we would abandon our positions and hide in the deepest holes we could find. We couldn't fight effectively when we were constantly taking cover from air attack, This was precisely the effect Allied air planners intended. Even when airstrikes didn't directly destroy German positions, they forced German infantry to take cover, disrupting their defensive fires and allowing Allied ground forces to advance. The psychological pressure was immense. German infantry never knew when aircraft might appear. They learned to camouflage their positions extensively, to avoid firing when aircraft were overhead, to dig deep shelters. But these measures reduced their tactical effectiveness. Time spent improving camouflage was time not spent improving fields of fire or coordinating with adjacent positions. The need to take cover when aircraft appeared meant German machine guns couldn't provide continuous defensive fire. The constant stress of aerial attack degraded morale and combat effectiveness, even when actual casualties from airstrikes were relatively light. Allied commanders understood this. Air support wasn't just about destroying targets, it was about maintaining pressure, disrupting German operations and creating conditions where German tactical proficiency couldn't be effectively employed. A German machine gun team forced to hide in a bunker every time aircraft appeared overhead couldn't defend against Allied ground attacks. A German company that had to move only at night because of air attacks couldn't quickly reinforce threatened sectors. A German battalion that couldn't mass for counterattacks because assembly areas were under constant aerial observation was unable to employ its forces effectively. The cumulative effect of artillery, armour, air support, and coordinated infantry tactics created a tactical environment where German defensive advantages were systematically negated. Individual German soldiers often fought with skill and courage. German weapons, including the MG-34 and MG-42, performed to their technical specifications, but the system within which they operated couldn't match Allied combined arms integration. The statistical evidence is overwhelming. In the first week of the Normandy campaign, German forces inflicted roughly equal casualties on Allied forces as they received, despite being under constant attack. German defensive positions, even when outnumbered, could inflict heavy casualties on attacking forces, but this ratio steadily shifted as Allied forces refined their tactics, and German forces were worn down by constant attrition. By late June, Allied forces were inflicting 2 casualties on German forces for every one they received. By late July, during Operation Cobra, the ratio had shifted to 3 or 4 to 1 in Allied favour. This wasn't because Allied soldiers suddenly became better fighters, or German soldiers worse. It was because Allied combined arms superiority had reached a level where German defensive tactics, built around machine gun strongpoints, simply couldn't function effectively. The ammunition consumption statistics tell their own story. In July 1944, American artillery in Normandy fired over 600,000 rounds of 105mm ammunition alone, not counting the hundreds of thousands of rounds from heavier artillery or mortars. German artillery, hampered by ammunition shortages and Allied air, interdiction of supply routes, fired approximately 1/10 that amount. This disparity meant that every American infantry attack could count on extensive artillery support, while German infantry often fought without any artillery support at all. The same pattern held for other resources. American infantry units received regular supplies of ammunition, food, and equipment. Casualties were replaced quickly with trained replacements from rear area depots. Damaged weapons were replaced from supply channels that stretched back to American factories. German units, by contrast, received irregular supplies that often arrived incomplete. Casualties were replaced slowly, if at all, and replacements were often poorly trained. Damaged weapons were repaired when possible, but rarely replaced. An American infantry company that took 30% casualties in an engagement would be back to full strength within a week. A German company with similar losses might wait weeks for replacements and never return to full strength. This logistical disparity reinforced the tactical disparity. Allied units could fight aggressively, accepting casualties because they knew they would be replaced. German units had to husband their strength, avoiding unnecessary losses because replacements weren't coming. This created a vicious cycle. German units fighting cautiously couldn't effectively counterattack or regain lost positions. Their passive defense made them vulnerable to Allied combined arms attacks. When they did suffer casualties, their reduced strength made them even more vulnerable to subsequent attacks. The MG-34 and MG-42, weapons designed to allow a small number of soldiers to hold large areas through concentrated firepower, required adequate personnel to function. A machine gun team that lost its assistant gunner or ammunition carrier became significantly less effective. The gunner had to handle ammunition feeding himself, reducing his rate of fire and increasing the chances of stoppages. A squad that lost half its riflemen couldn't carry enough ammunition for sustained operations and couldn't provide adequate local security for the machine gun position. As German infantry units were worn down by constant attrition, the effectiveness of their machine gun-centered tactics degraded proportionally. By August 1944, many German infantry companies in Normandy were operating at 40 or 50% of their authorized strength. They still had their machine guns, but they lacked the personnel to employ those guns effectively. A machine gun position that should have had 6 or 8 men nearby for security and fire support might have only 3 or 4. This made them vulnerable to infiltration and close assault. Allied infantry learned to identify these weakened positions and exploit them. American and British infantry tactics in late July and August increasingly emphasized infiltration and exploitation. Rather than conducting frontal attacks against German strongpoints, Allied units would probe for weaknesses, identify undermanned positions, and rapidly exploit any breakthrough. Once Allied forces penetrated German lines, the machine gun-centered defensive system collapsed. Machine guns positioned to fire to the front were vulnerable from flanks and rear. German infantry doctrine called for positions to be mutually supporting. But when units were undermanned and spread thin, gaps appeared. Allied forces poured through these gaps, rolling up German positions from the flanks and rear. The collapse of German forces in the Falaise pocket in mid-August 1944 exemplified this. German units, already weakened by 2 months of constant combat, attempted to retreat eastward toward the Seine. Allied forces advancing from multiple directions with overwhelming artillery and air support caught German units in the open. The result was catastrophic. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers were captured. Thousands more were killed. Virtually all heavy equipment, including the machine guns that had been the centerpiece of German infantry tactics, was lost. Survivors described roads choked with destroyed vehicles, fields littered with abandoned equipment, and a complete breakdown of command and control. The machine gun teams that had inflicted such heavy casualties on Allied forces earlier in the campaign were now themselves casualties or prisoners. The weapon that was supposed to dominate the battlefield through superior sustained firepower had been rendered irrelevant by an operational and tactical system it couldn't match. The lessons from Normandy shaped Allied tactics for the rest of the war and beyond. The emphasis on combined arms integration at all levels, from squad to army, became fundamental to Western military doctrine. No weapon system, regardless of technical superiority, could be decisive without the supporting systems needed to employ it effectively. This principle guided American and British military development through the Cold War and into the present day. Modern Western military forces assume combined arms operations as baseline doctrine. Infantry don't operate without fire support, artillery coordinates with maneuver forces, air support integrates seamlessly with ground operations. The communications, logistics, and training systems needed to enable this integration are considered as important as the weapons themselves. For the Germans, the experience was traumatic. Post-war German military analysis recognized that they had lost, not because their weapons or soldiers were inferior, but because they had failed to develop the systems needed for modern warfare. The MG-34 and MG-42 entered post-war German service with the Bundeswehr, and the MG-3, a modernized version of the MG-42, remains in service with some militaries today. But it serves within a very different tactical framework, one that emphasizes combined arms integration rather than machine gun dominance. The story of the MG-34 in Normandy is ultimately a story about the evolution of warfare. Technical excellence in individual weapons remains important, but it's insufficient without the systems to employ those weapons effectively. The Germans created one of the finest machine guns ever built and developed tactics to maximize its effectiveness. But they failed to create the supporting systems, logistics, communications, coordination that modern warfare demanded. The Allies, learning from early defeats, built those systems and used them to neutralize German tactical advantages. When the MG-34 met coordinated Allied fire in the hedgerows of Normandy, it wasn't a contest between weapons but between systems, and the Allied system, for all its individual imperfections, proved overwhelmingly superior to the German alternative. That was the day the MG-34 lost its edge, and that edge never returned.